So this session is going to cover the FLINT software. I'm not going to go into too much of Moja Global here because we did cover so much of it yesterday. Of course, if there's questions, please come up and ask them. But the aim here is to tell you how and why we developed the FLINT. Why did we make these decisions? Because it's really important to understand that we weren't trying to sort of create a piece of software out of interest. There was a real need and a real problem that we were trying to solve when we started this. And what we're seeing as this system evolves is the needs are getting greater and greater, and that means that the system has to evolve along with those vastly increasing needs. I'm going to go into the core design principles of the FLINT, and I am going to go through the types of data that need to go into it, and we'll see those especially coming through in the examples. About halfway through the presentation, I'm actually going to stop and I'm going to hand the floor to Anthony Quaget because he has developed a fantastic reporting tool. It's much, much better than listening to me drone on for 90 minutes like you had to yesterday. My apologies for that, especially with the Australian accent, I'm sure doesn't help. So breaking it up with a high quality Kenyan accent, I think is really going to get in there, and you can see what Anthony has managed to achieve in working with Moja on this now. So with no further ado, I am going to get into the problem that we saw at first. So the problem that we saw when we started with this was we were doing some work again with the Clinton Foundation and with the government of Kenya and others, and I think I explained this a little bit yesterday. And one of the problems we hit was that there was some good data and there were some new maps being produced and there were models that existed, but there was no framework for pulling all of this together. And that meant that what we were trying to do was take all of those fantastic models, take all of those measurements, and then summarize them up into something like an Excel sheet, or write a script that could turn them into a table so we could multiply them by another table. Now, it doesn't take long to realize that firstly, that is a very error-prone process. It's highly risky. You lose a lot of your QA/QC. You lose a lot of the ability and the transparency of what's going on. And yes, you may end up with a very simple Excel sheet that you can then say, multiply number A by number B, and we can see that's correct. You've actually lost the tracking all the way back to the core data. You've also thrown away a lot of the really useful information from that data, you know, the spatial side of that data, for example, or the interesting interactions that may be happening across the landscape due to different activities. So this comes to a fantastic slide and a cartoon that Werner has used for many years, and I continue to steal. And it's basically one where you have a whole lot of data, and in the middle, you just make an assumption. And if that assumption's missing, then you can't put these things together. And this is what we're here to do. So as with yesterday, it's always good to try to come up with what some integration is. And we've defined integration as the systematic combination of multiple data types, methods, and processes without degrading any of the data. So that means that our aim is that if we have spatial systems, we keep the data spatial. If we have dense time series information from models, we keep that information available to us at all times. And that means that we always have this richness of information that we can bring to bear on numerous different policy problems. In MRV, what we're talking about for integration is a software platform, and the FLINT in specifically here, around how do we bring together all of those things we're just talking about, the remote sensing, the models, the spatial data, the ground data. There is a lot of data out there. Data is not really the problem. So the idea is to stack all of this information together, but it stacks it in a very, very different way to a traditional GIS system. And this is something we're going to talk about later on. If you're used to GIS systems, what you'll be used to is what's known as space then time, or just space. You create a map and then you create another map and then you create another map and you try to difference those maps. And that can be quite effective to a point. but you get to a point where you get too many maps and it's very difficult to run that. The FLINT uses those maps, so it certainly need GIS systems, you certainly need all this spatial information, but it actually runs a time then space analysis. There's a significant difference there, and we're going to talk about that a bit later on. But the general concept is that you stack a lot of data together. You then run models across all of that data. They could be tier 1, as we said, to tier 2 to tier 3. The concept is fairly simple. The carbon stocks and fluxes are driven by spatial and temporal variation. So you get spatial variation in changes in land use and activities. You get temporal variation because those activities occur at different points in time, and depending on the models that you're running, for example, they may be climate sensitive. So they will also have impacts through time on what may be happening in your landscape. The challenge is that representing that is really, really, really complicated, because if you think about the sheer volume of individual little unique pieces of land across a landscape, it adds up very quickly, especially when you go through time. And that's what the FLINT looks to fix. What do I mean by complex systems? Is thinking about even just a really simple model, an emissions factor multiplied by activity data to get to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you may only have a couple of those at a national scale, but then if you decide to add subnational boundaries into that, you end up with a lot more. If you then add the boundaries of subnational boundaries over forest types, you get a lot more. If you start adding the subnational boundaries over the forest types over time steps, you get a lot more. And you can keep adding more and more of these factors on here. And eventually a very simple equation, AD times EF, in an implementation perspective becomes extraordinarily complex. And this is just a simple emissions factor approach. So you can imagine what can happen if you start going to more advanced models. And this is the issue that the FLINT is looking to address. The other point that we looked at was around the types of data that are becoming available. And there's no doubt that there's a very big focus in the land sector these days on remote sensing data. There's a good reason for that. It is going to be extremely useful. It is becoming more useful. It is vastly improving day by day, and the volumes of information are huge. But it is not the only data set or information that we have. We have models, and that includes tier 1 to tier 3, and we have GIS systems. So what we've attempted to do here is note where the strengths and weaknesses of those three approaches are. So if you're looking for land cover or land use change, the remote sensing is very useful. Models less so, although you could put in low here if you're looking for models of predicted where deforestation, for example, may occur. So that could be low these days, but GIS systems would also be low. If you're looking to directly estimate biomass or estimate your biomass, in particular your greenhouse gas emissions, remote sensing is generally pretty low. It's probably moving towards medium with things like the JEDI mission, but it's still not operating in time series properly. And so I think it still sits at low, and we can all have a good argument about that later on and where that's going to go. Same with carbon. Models are very good for that. GIS isn't. If you're looking for multiple measures, so when I say multiple measures here, I'm thinking much more around what if you're looking at co-benefits, for example, maybe biodiversity. What if you're looking at projections and scenarios, other land uses, products and bioenergy? The net summary here, whether you agree or disagree with all of the comments in this table, is that when you actually stick them together in a coherent way, you can actually meet all of the needs. It's a matter of how you put them together. And that's really the core aspect of the FLINT.
Rob, before
you've seen a similar diagram. Go, Werner.
Yeah, there was a question. Can you go back to the previous slide? There was a question a moment ago about what models are used in FLINT. And just to come back to what we talked about yesterday, FLINT is an integrating platform to which we can attach modules that describe the dynamics of croplands, forests, grasslands, wetlands, etc. And which models you use to attach to the platform depends very much on the data that you have available, the knowledge that you have available in your country, whether models exist or whether or not you want to use existing models or modules as a starting point, or just a simple emission factor as a starting point, and then progressively improve on that as you proceed with the implementation of the system. And I think, Rob, in your next slide, you have examples of that, so maybe you can take it from here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll step through that very briefly. I won't go into this too much more because there's a lot of additional slides on here. So the quick summary for the role of integration here is that we do need data from all different sources, and it's as simple as that, and that's not going to change anytime in the near future. There is no one technology or approach that's going to provide all of this information. It is going to be how do we pull it together. We've tried to put this graphically to show where the FLINT sits. And the aim here, if you look at this, is just very simple diagram. We have ground data across the top. We have remote sensing data, for example, across the bottom. And then on the x-axis along there, we have all of the processes that you're going to be running as you move forward. And that moves from just getting the basic data, maybe collecting forest inventory data or downloading satellite data. You then have the data processing, you then have to make products. But then at some point you have to start getting to reporting. And once you hit that reporting point, that's where you have to start integrating all of this data. And then as you move forward, then you suddenly move to projections and analysis and forecasting. And this is where these systems are starting to move. And so you have something like the ALU, which is great for reporting and a little bit of projections. You have FullCam and the CBM, which have a lot of capabilities around reporting, projections and analytics, but have some limitations due to their age, as we discussed later and as we'll discuss later. And then the FLINT system, which is trying to take that out into the next generation tool. So the other question around why integration, it's not just about making it more accurate and making pretty maps. One of the great aspects of integration processes when they're well built are these. Firstly, it really reduces your process inefficiencies. So where you have to if you have a lot of repetitive tasks, then those can be largely automated and take out a lot of those repetitive tasks. That includes running scripts over data. For example, if you need to take a huge pile of land cover maps and then run these big scripts over the top to produce a table that says here's how much land was cleared every year, you don't need those scripts anymore because the system itself replaces all of those. It can greatly reduce errors, and the primary ones there are reducing the errors through manual handling. So manual handling of data and writing scripts is error prone, and importantly, you can also start to put checks over the data. So if numbers or information falls outside a range, then that can be reported and you can start finding those errors in that way. The other advantage is that you can reduce the issues of spatial gaps and double counting. So what this means is that if you're running a spatially explicit system, you know that each land unit has only been counted once. Whereas if you are running scripts over a whole lot of different maps, you're not sure whether those scripts have picked up the same land unit twice, or if they've accidentally missed a land unit. And so this is really a key thing to be able to say, we know that we've avoided those problems across the landscape. The responsiveness is higher because you can answer questions very quickly. You don't need to rerun spreadsheets. You don't need to rerun systems all the time. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And very strongly on user-driven improvement. So these are actual reasons that are much more from an operational perspective of why we believe that integration is a really key part of moving forward. And a lot of these things that I've mentioned here really go towards that transparency problem. How do you address transparency when you are running lots and lots of scripts to get from here to a data input? Well, that's very difficult. But if you are just putting these data inputs in and you have a reliable framework for doing that, then that becomes less of an issue. So I'll talk briefly about just a brief history of the land use integration tools as we see it. And of course, people, please feel free to jump in if you have other ideas here. But when we look at the first generation tools, and I'm largely thinking here the FullCams and the CBM CFS 3s, largely built in the late 90s as a design, ongoing improvement, and they are still used inside these countries. So Canada and Australia still run those systems for their national inventories. They're reliable. They do the job that's required. They're well respected. They're well known. So that's a great aspect of those tools. They're built around country-specific policy goals, and this, in some ways, leads to the limitations. So FLINT in Australia, the key country-specific policy goal at the time was deforestation and reforestation. The tool was designed specifically to deal with those issues. It could deal with forestry, it could deal with crops, but at the time it wasn't designed for that. And so it had a really specific need. In Canada, the policy need was mainly around forestry, forest harvesting, fires and pests. And that really is what drove that system. But when you see the actual designs, you'll see that remarkably similar in concept. They've all been used for policy development. Werner has put out so many papers on policy issues that I'd let him talk to that if you're interested in them around forest issues. But, you know, that's the same in Australia. And as I showed yesterday in a quick example, you have these tools being run in carbon markets. So very useful, but highly limited because of their age and because they were designed for specific purposes in mind. And this is what led us to go down to the second generation work and of the FLINT, starting in 2015. The key problems were we saw that the first generation tools weren't going to be able to cope with all of the new data coming in, especially the volume of remote sensing information we were getting. They certainly weren't going to be able to cope with many of the new policy issues, in particular covering the entire land sector efficiently, so expanding the sectors, and also how are you going to start dealing with markets. So we needed a globally applicable generic framework and the ability to work with all of the new data. That's where we've basically been driving the second generation work. When I mention those first generation tools, these are the two that I'm talking about at a high level. And when you look at these, you'll see that they're actually remarkably similar. They use very different data streams. They use different modeling concepts, but the actual framework concept is very similar. In the Canadian side, you have the CBM CFS3. It is the integrating system. It does all of the calculations reliably. And into that system, you put in your growth and yield curves, you put in your forest inventory, you put in your land use changes, and you put in all the disturbance events that have occurred. The system integrates that data and provides a highly detailed reports database, results database that is then used for international reporting, policy, all of these other things. When you go across to the Australian system, you'll see it's not that much different. There's a core system in the middle, FLINT. It's designed to integrate the data. Of course, Australia has far less data on forests than Canada. And it had different policy issues as described with deforestation. And so for that reason, we designed a system that was relying on time series remote sensing data over the continent using Landsat, a whole lot of land management information so that when something was deforested, we knew what it had been deforested to. That obviously has impacts on the ongoing soil loss. And then a large amount of models and soils data to help drive forest biomass models, to drive soil carbon models. All of those get put into an integrating framework, and then those drop out into maps and graphs. So the integrating framework design concept is not particularly new. What is new is how to actually make it more efficient and make it usable. So I won't read out all of the parts on the FLINT, but I want to concentrate on the parts on the right-hand side, the core principles, because this was actually something that we did spend time on and really helped drive what do we want the FLINT to actually be able to achieve. And many of these I've noted before, but some I haven't. So the first one is that it needs to be flexible, and that's come out in all of the discussions so far. We wanted it to be able to be used around the world. They had to be able to modify the system to be able to put in different data and different models. That's reasonably clear. Another key need was to understand that we needed it to be scalable and it needed to support nesting. So we didn't want a tool that could only run at a project level. We wanted something that could be scaled on new compute resources, for example, and you could run everything from a project to a national level to a full global level. And we have in fact run the FLINT at a global scale at 25 meters. So that's been proven that that is possible. The advantage of that was to also support nesting. for those that are interested in markets. So how can you ensure that projects are also being included into the national accounts? We definitely wanted it to be data agnostic, so we didn't want it restricted to any data type or format. We wanted everything to be consistent and ensuring comparability. And in this case, one of the problems we'd found previously was that you might have one group running one type of models using climate data, another group running a different set of models using climate data. They're trying to compare their results, but how do you know that they've used the same climate data inputs? You don't. And that means that you're not sure if the changes are because of the parameters, because of the variables, or because of the models. And this becomes really tricky. So the idea here was to set up a framework that could solve that problem. Probably one of the most important ones that should really be at the top in many ways was that it needed to be operational and scientific. So we discussed operational yesterday, and what we meant by that was that it works and it can be relied on and it's bug-free, and that when it does a calculation, it does that calculation correctly. So not dissimilar to Excel. When I go to Excel and I type 2 + 2 into a cell, I expect it to give out 4. If it gives out anything different than 4, I'd be unbelievably surprised. That's where we need to be with the FLINT, so that people don't question the back-end framework. People don't question whether Excel is doing the calculations correctly. People will question whether you type the equation incorrectly, the model itself, but they're not going to question the framework. It also needed to be scientific from the perspective of we wanted to be able to do things like maintain mass balance of stocks and flows. And by that, I mean making sure that any losses of carbon to the atmosphere or carbon coming out of the atmosphere into the ecosystem was actually sensible, and it all added up, so that again we weren't getting double counting of emissions or carbon stocks through time. And finally, we needed it to look at how we take advantage of all the new compute technology, and some of that we showed yesterday as well. It's not just about how fast we can run it, it's how can you display the results, how can you query the results. Those are the core design principles that we focused on when we started this. And this is where we ended up. And you'll see several diagrams that look a bit like this over the coming slides, but the core concept is very simple. You have input data on one side, on the left-hand side. That goes into a system where you can manage all of your data. That is up to you as to how you manage that system. You then have the FLINT in the middle. The FLINT is managing that input data. So it is finding the land units, and it is finding all of the information on that land unit, the land use history, the climate, all of that information for that tiny little individual land unit. Around the outside of the FLINT, we then have models, or as we call them, modules. So when we have a model and we attach it to the FLINT, we call it a FLINT module. Those modules subscribe to the FLINT effectively. And as the FLINT is running, it's talking to those modules, and those modules are saying, I need to run now. They run a time step and they come back. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that time step issue later. There are extra modules on here that you'll see, like a finance module and a biodiversity module. Most of those are either don't currently exist, or they are a proof of concept that exists, but the concept remains the same. The FLINT only cares about stocks and flows. You get to define what those stocks and flows are. So if the stock and flow is carbon, if the stock and flow is money, that's largely up to you. It can all be put in one framework. That then attaches to maps and output databases, and then you can view that data at the back. So as a very quick summary of what I've just been talking about, what we want to say is that to meet all of the complex needs, we really have to move beyond spreadsheets, and to be frank, most likely need to move beyond R scripts and other systems like that. We're actually going to require data from lots of different sources, and that's really the key aspect of the FLINT. The idea of integration is not new. It's been highly successful. It's been very successfully implemented for over 20 years in several countries. It's been used for international reporting. It's been used for policy development. It's been used to support markets. So we don't have to worry about the concept of integration. That is well and truly sorted. The issue then, or the main thing now, is the next generation tools. How can we actually bring those so that all of those lessons from that, developing those first generation integration systems, how can they be brought to bear to help other countries out?